Good evening, everyone. Thanks for hanging around to the end of the day to come and see my talk. My name is Lawrence Munro, and this is my talk, InfoSec Philosophies about for the corrupt economy. So just a brief bit about myself and why you should consider listening to me, I guess. So I'm the worldwide VP of Spy Labs. I oversee the pen testing and red teams. I'm former director of B-Sides London, which is a great event. I'm a postgraduate student at Oxford University, which is where I spent a lot of my time pulling together all the information for this talk and a lot of the thinking that I did around it. I also used to be a penetration tester and social engineer. So typically the talks that I do are much more technical as a rule, and this one's a bit more fluffy. So forgive me if I go off on a tangent or get a bit technical. A lot of my heroes I've been able to meet behind the scenes at Black Hat, so I've been really pleased for that opportunity. I'm a bit of a fanboy. I won't shame any of them. But if you want to talk to me afterwards, please come up to me, ask any questions that you've got, or just DM or tweet me on the embarrassing handles that I put on the board there. So, what is this talk about? So the talk comes from a side project that I did at Oxford while I was studying there, and my travels over the last few years. I travelled to a lot of different countries, a lot of less economically developed countries, and did a lot of security consulting. So a lot of my kind of anecdotes in this talk and some of the thinking comes from that. Also the idea that a lot of the philosophies and a lot of the ways that we construct security frameworks and information tend to come from countries like the US, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, and a lot of them don't really apply when you look at different economies and different companies in different countries. So a lot of the time it lacks a lot of relevance, and you struggle to move ahead with security. So a lot of it's based around that. So for most, I think that there's a general abstraction as a consequence of our kind of working lives and our personal lives, that safety doesn't really come into effect. Like, you know, when you do your day-to-day job, you don't really worry about whether you're safe and secure and whether the impacts of doing the job that you do has any kind of risk to your personal well-being. At the start of this project, I conducted around 15 interviews with various people, a lot of them who were involved in corruption, just for around a couple of hours each. Some of them I actually visited the countries and spent some time with people, and other times it was just on Skype through contacts I had within the industry. And a lot of the ideas I got from that I kind of combined with secondary research about different economies, different countries, my own ideas about security and how we can make this better and hopefully improve what we do around these types of areas. Hopefully it's not too boring. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is security in the enterprise. For those of you who are avid Star Trek fans like me, you probably know that the enterprise has pretty poor security. The AI doesn't put the shields up when a threat arises automatically. Their crypto can be hacked just by rearranging some clear coloured disks. And there's a big insider threat. So quite often what you find is one of the crew goes rogue and runs off with someone or commits some sort of offence. So for me, that's really similar to the enterprise, as in the commercial enterprise and companies. Security quite often is a bit of an afterthought, and from my experience as a pen tester, it quite often means that security is a bit poor, just like on Star Trek. I apologise in advance, there's quite a lot of Star Trek references in here. So security doesn't work if your trusted people aren't trustworthy. So part of what this talk relates to is things like exotic threat modelling, so thinking about edge cases and different ways in which your organisation can be compromised if you operate overseas, especially in less economically developed countries. So quite often the victims can also be the threat actors. So people where they're coerced or forced into doing things, sometimes they can actually be the victims as well as having financial losses for an organisation too. So really this kind of mirrors something that's quite popular at the moment around zero trust networks, and some of the ideas that I've thought about in this talk kind of are related to things like zero trust networks and OPSEC that assumes that the originators are untrusted. So firstly, I think it's probably a good idea just to define what I think corruption is and what the dictionary says really as well. So to be corrupt, you must be in a position of authority and have the ability to enact your will. In many cases, this can include coercion and bribery. So just a quick exercise, can we show a quick show of hands, anyone who's kind of come across any type of institutionalised corruption or corruption in their workplace? Maybe someone's borrowed an iPhone charger and then not brought it back. Maybe you suspected the Russians and started a whole campaign. I didn't see any hands. Oh, we've got a couple up the front. So keep your hands raised if it was you behind it and you've been selling all the iPhone chargers on eBay. No? Okay. Interesting. Thank you. So most of us as security professionals sit in our offices, or if you're like me and you work from home, normally in my underwear on the sofa, with a sense of abstraction from what impacts in our work. So like I said before, where you're kind of abstracted from the situation, you don't feel any personal threat related to your kind of day-to-day job. And when we create security frameworks and operational routines, we can quite often make a lot of assumptions. And the assumptions that we make kind of are along the lines of, you know, this will work everywhere because they have relevance in the US or in Europe. And the biggest problem that we have is from hackers, and we'll fight the hackers at work and then we go home and everything's fine. And our personal lives are assumed separate, and that's how we kind of operate. We can assume that our way is best because we're the richest, we've got the biggest organisations, we're the biggest target, or we just buy into nationalism and the kind of rhetoric that we kind of get from governments. Moreover, there can be an assumption as well that insider threats really only occur from low privileged worker bees in an organisation, and the people at the top are generally the people trying to do security well and trying to do all these things in the right way, which is not always true. So something I want to talk about as well is cognitive biases. So a friend of mine is a neuroscience, and we talk about these quite a lot. So humans are pretty good at kidding ourselves, especially if there's some kind of evolutionary advantage to it. So I'm assuming most of you have heard of cognitive biases, but if you haven't, cognitive biases are essentially a predisposition to think or react in a certain way under certain circumstances based on environmental cues. So essentially you behave in a way because you're a human and you're pre-programmed to do so because at some point in time that was advantageous to you. So in particular, the illusion of control bias is one that is quite straightforward, but also relates to when you create different models and can also impact us. So this bias states that humans tend to believe they have more control over external events that they can't control than they actually do. So typically you'll think that you can control something or do something. Maybe you're outsourcing to somewhere and you think, hey, I can manage this remotely just because I'm awesome. But the reality is that people make those mistakes, and science has proven that those quite often aren't the case. So one of the first interviews that I did was actually going to Nigeria. And I travelled to Lagos even in Nigeria to meet with the African regional CISO of a global bank. Quite a few international banks actually have branches and operations in sub-Saharan Africa, which was quite surprising to me at the time. And obviously I won't name the bank or the individual concerned, but the gentleman I worked with was the kind of regional CISO. In Nigeria, there's quite strong links between local government and organised crime. So organised crime is really strong. What they have is gangs, lots of local gangs they call area boys, and they interact with the government through workers' unions, such as railway unions and unions of workers that are kind of spread throughout the cities. And in this case, the area boys, the gangs that were extorting, would regularly take money from the people in the security department. One of the biggest incidents that they explained to me was when the leader of the gang demanded that they sell all of their assets in terms of their IT equipment on eBay and then give them the profits. Following this, the organisation, the bank, realised that this was happening and called the local police. Unfortunately, the local police were operated by the local government, who was also corrupt and being paid off by the local gangs. What actually ended up happening was the two immigrant workers from China were actually got pinned for it and spent 10 years in jail on the follow-up from that. In the end, the company didn't really understand what happened. They replaced the servers and accepted the loss. So there was their ignorance kind of made people pay, and whoever's fault it is debatable. So another interesting case that I found was interviewing through a colleague a guy in Greece who was actually a black hat hacker. And he worked for a bank quite closely connected to local government and a financial regulator. And his boss actually expressly hired him to hack people, as well as do his job as a penetration tester. So the idea was that they were going to bribe local officials and also attack competitors in competitive situations to get information about them. So he explained his role was really to get personal information off people, and because in Greece, quite a lot of the time, the corruption in local governments is quite public. People would share information on their email accounts and things like that. So a lot of the information that he gathered was pretty easy, and they were successful in bribing a lot of the officials. So the form that this took was one of the officials in an example he gave me was actually that he was paying for his children to go to university in the UK, and he bought his wife a Lamborghini and a Ferrari within the same year with all the local funds. I don't know how anyone didn't notice apart from this guy hacking the emails, but local officials don't normally get paid that much. So he was able to quite openly glean this information from these people, and then bribery ensued. They bribed him, and then they found out that, he actually paid them out of more public money, so it kind of perpetuated the issue. Another one of the blackmailers' roles in the organisation was to do what I call pay for pass audits. So he located individuals who would pass things like ISO 27001 audits on the basis that he'd give them money. So what actually happened was they took the organisation that was doing the audit for them would take their other jobs that they'd done and just change the names on the paper and then put them on there, and then charge really high rates for long terms, and that was the way that they would pay for these. The organisation, the parent company of the bank, didn't actually check into this because all they were interested in was just a tick box. And obviously in security there's a difference between being compliant and being secure. So this is really all they looked at, and it's quite a good lesson that these things can happen. So quite literally, they had a false sense of security further up the chain, and the limited view on the security posture of the organisation as a result. So interestingly, this is quite old hat, so to speak, and the differences between white hats and black hats and what is a grey hat is quite different. Normally you'd think that the intersection would be where a grey hat would live on this kind of diagram, but from my perspective, it's quite different in different countries. What's actually legal and what qualifies as being legal or illegal in a country might dictate how people feel ethically about what white hat and grey hats are. So for most computer misuse acts or most computer misuse laws in countries, there's really two core concepts there. So one is permission or ownership to access assets, and the other is intent. So with a black hat, obviously they breach both of these. They're going into systems that they're not meant to, and they're doing things with malicious intent. Whereas traditionally you might think that a grey hat, obviously visiting systems that they don't own, but their intent isn't malicious. But from a perspective of the law, they're definitely black hats because they're doing something that is natively illegal. In different countries, they have different advancements on their laws. Some are very immature, and in some cases, they don't really care about whether people have got any intent or whatever. They'll just release them. And in this case, the black cat in question actually was caught in the end, but he got away with it, basically. He didn't go to trial, and he blamed his boss for it under the guise that the computer misuse laws were very, very weak in Greece at the time. So one of the best mitigations for these sorts of threats is good security fundamentals. So in my role, and probably a lot of the people in the room, you spend a lot of time talking about basics and doing basics well and security hygiene. So in terms of how we approach this threat, you could assume a model of zero trust. And by zero trust, I mean there's consequences that come with that. Obviously, if you kind of blacklist a country within your organisation, it becomes very hard to actually operate, and they'll probably feel like they're being mistreated or all tarred with the same brush, that they're not to be trusted. So it causes issues. Another type of approach is to build a kind of demilitarised zone, similar to what you do on a network, and use that to mitigate the risks. So a lot of organisations do these types of things where they move decisions into other countries, they push a lot of the network and infrastructure into different locations, and that's kind of effective to some extent if it's implemented well. There's always the option of perpetuating the system as well. So a lot of organisations will take the stance that it's actually cheaper to just bribe people and continue with the corruption within the companies and within the local governments. So a lot of organisations will actually partake in the corruption and keep things going with contractors and paying, because it's cheaper long term, obviously with ethical dilemmas around these types of things. So we should also explore exotic threat models as well, as I mentioned before. So thinking about the way that these types of individuals operate, and make sure that you have the kind of intelligence about how they operate by doing secondary research in kind of the correct ways. So what can we definitely do to impact this and to make this better? So quite often paying market rates can make the difference between individuals being kind of on the edge of doing something illegal to make slightly more money. And if they're mistreated in the organisation and used as an asset, that will also impact them as well. So paying market rates has quite a good impact, and treating your staff well is a good way to do that. So also you should do the socially responsible thing as an organisation. It might sound like a kind of high ideal, but organisations with a lot of money that operate and offshore, especially into less economically developed countries, should always focus on working with the local governments on anti-corruption laws and funding different efforts to do it. They should take care of their staff and really focus on doing the right things within those markets that they serve. Also, you should not think about witch hunts. So witch hunts are where you go after individuals or sack someone on the basis of an independent behaviour. So that is kind of, in my opinion, an error in security culture more generally, because what it means is that people will then hide mistakes and errors that they make from you. And a lot of the time, as I said earlier, these people will be the victims as well as the people who are kind of performing all the malicious acts. So it's really important to make sure that you have an open and honest dialogue in security culture and try and develop that, especially in these types of economies. So just some final thoughts as I'm wrapping up, and to leave you with some kind of thoughts of my own. So is this our future where privacy and security are commodities? So this kind of links into the second point as well about organised security devolving over time. So I think where you have things like GDPR in the EU, where there's actually real penalties and the regulators have teeth to penalise the companies financially that do bad security or have breaches, I think that's counterintuitive, because a lot of the time what can happen is individual companies will they'll create your your data as a commodity. And what I mean by that is what will happen is it's probably cheaper for an organisation, or it may be cheaper for an organisation to do bad security. And the reason behind that is because if they don't spend much on security, they're not going to see things like breaches, so they won't have much information. If you don't see the breach, then you don't have to respond it. In GDPR, as an example, you have a 72-hour window whereby you need to disclose major breaches to your regulator. And if you have bad security that doesn't cost much, you don't see the breach, and then you don't get fined. So there's kind of a disincentive to actually do that and to have good security sometime. And I think that what that means is that security devolves, and also you create commodities out of people's identities. So as an individual, you have to think about giving your data to which organisations, but you probably don't understand how they manage your data and what their approach is, and whether it's kind of means tested by actuaries to decide whether they're going to defend your data or not, because it costs them more or less to do so. Also about propagating these corrupt systems and being part of that. So that's an ethical dilemma, I think. A lot of the time it can be a lot cheaper for organisations to partake in these kinds of practices, but I think ethically, there's a dilemma there, and people should consider that. It's quite easy to think of people in other countries far away who are maybe much poorer than you in different lights than you would someone who's in the office sitting next to you. So I think we have a social responsibility about that as well, to address the last point, that we need to do better when we outsource and do better when we look at these different types of things with corruption. So in summary, I think, we can just do better. I think there are ways to mitigate these risks and to model the threats that happen, but we just need to be more mindful and really respect the countries that we work in and operate in. I'll just open up for some questions at the end, I guess, if anyone has any, and I can jump on, have a chat with anyone afterwards as well. Thank you. Oh.
Hi, I was just wondering what advice you would have for people starting their own company in terms of that ethical dilemma if your monetization is based on sharing data.
So if you're a small company and you're starting up and you're worried about monetizing data, so in what sense, sorry?
So say that part of your strategy is monetizing data, but you want to monetize it maybe for advertising purposes, more innocent purposes, but you don't want data mining companies to be able to use it to sway elections, for example.
Sure, yeah. A bit of a loaded question there with a Cambridge Analytica. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I think you just need to decide your own ethics, really, on, you need to look at legislation and look at the law, and then also decide what you're comfortable with. I think there's definitely a legitimacy to advertising as long as people are consenting and they understand how you handle their data. So I think as long as you're ticking those boxes, that you're transparent in how you handle the data, how it will be used, and how you collect it, I think that's, there's a fairness around that. People, Facebook, for example, a lot of what they do is based on the premise that they give you a service, and the trade-off is that you get advertisements and things like that. You get advertised to. So I think as long as it's transparent and they don't contravene any of your rights or any laws, then I would say setting up a business, I would, as long as you're true to your convictions, I think, there's a right way to do it, and it is possible to do it quite well. Thanks. Cool. Thank you.